Rain fell in steady sheets that morning, the kind that seemed to wash the world clean, yet made everything feel heavier. Among the misty gravestones of a quiet cemetery, a lone figure moved with purpose. He was impeccably dressed, every detail screamed wealth and power, but there was a weight in his shoulders, a shadow in his eyes, that no amount of money could hide. This was Richard Hayes, billionaire, a man used to getting anything he wanted, except peace. He had come here for a reason no one could understand. His daughter Emily had passed away 2 years ago, leaving a void that nothing could fill. Every boardroom deal, every lavish party, every headline in the papers felt meaningless without her. Today, he promised himself, he would stand by her grave and speak the words he had been holding in his heart all this time. As he approached, something unusual caught his attention. A figure crouched by the grave, an older man, hunched, trembling slightly in the rain, with an expression that made Richard pause. The man was not dressed in mourning clothes. Instead, his clothes were worn and plain. A janitor, perhaps. But there was something in his posture, a raw human grief that pulled at Richard's chest in a way he hadn't felt in years. His hand rested on the headstone, and in his other hand, a small child clutched his coat, hiding her face from the rain. Tears streamed down the man's cheeks, carving clean lines through the dirt and rain. Richard froze. He had seen grief before news stories, social media, even funerals, but never like this. Never so raw, so honest, so human. "Excuse me," Richard's voice was firm but uncertain. The man looked up, startled, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. His eyes were red, swollen, yet filled with a kind of strength that defied his appearance. I'm sorry," the man said, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to." Richard stepped closer, his curiosity overtaking caution. "Who are you?" he asked genuinely, not with the usual arrogance of someone used to commanding answers. "My name is James," the janitor said. I just needed to be here." Richard glanced at the child, who peeked from behind James, shivering. Something about the scene stirred memories he had buried deep. Emily, with her laughter, her tiny hands wrapped around his finger, gone in an instant. And now, here was James, a stranger, showing a grief so personal it made him question everything he thought he knew about life. A thought struck him, sudden and sharp. Why was a janitor here, crying over a grave? And more disturbingly, why did the child look familiar? There was a flicker of recognition, impossible to place, that left Richard uneasy. He wanted to walk away, to retreat into the safety of his luxury, and leave the rain and grief to strangers. But something stopped him, a pull he could not name. He took a deep breath, feeling the rain soak through his expensive coat, and asked the question that would change everything. "Why are you here?" James hesitated, then spoke softly, almost a whisper carried by the wind. "She asked me to promise her something. I promised. I couldn't let her down." Richard's mind raced. A promise, to a child. He felt a chill, a suspicion creeping in like ice under his skin. There was more to this than met the eye. He wanted answers, but he also feared them. Before he could ask another question, James glanced at the child and said, "We should go. It's not safe to linger here." Richard felt his pulse quicken. Not safe. In a cemetery, what was going on, and why did he suddenly feel like he was on the edge of discovering something he could never unlearn? Then, instinctively, he took a step closer to the janitor. "I want to help," he said, though even he didn't fully understand why. James looked at him, confused and wary. You want to help?" "Yes," Richard said. "I don't know how, but yes, I can't explain it." The child peeked up, her eyes wide, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Richard realized this encounter was not random. Fate, timing, and perhaps a little bit of divine mischief had brought him here. And whatever was about to unfold would shake him in ways money never could. And then James spoke words Richard would never forget. "She needs you more than you think." Richard felt the ground tilt beneath him. Shock, disbelief, suspicion, all tangled in a single knot of fear and anticipation. Who was this child? Why did James say she needed him? And what did any of this have to do with his daughter's grave? He had come seeking closure. Instead, he found questions he wasn't ready to answer. And as the rain poured down harder, Richard realized his life, his carefully constructed world, was about to unravel in ways he could never imagine. The truth was waiting, hidden in plain sight, and Richard was standing right on top of it. Next, Richard follows James and the mysterious child, uncovering secrets that will make him question everything he believed about life, family, and trust. He looked back at Richard, his expression unreadable in the dim light, and gave a slight nod, as if granting him permission to follow. Richard hesitated for a second, 1,000 questions racing through his mind. But then, he stepped forward. The rain had soaked him to the bone, but he didn't care. A powerful instinct told him that the answers he didn't even know he was seeking were inside that crypt, or somewhere very close by. Inside, the air was still and cool. A soft flicker of light danced against the stone walls. A few candles burned faintly, illuminating the worn, damp interior. Richard's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he could see small, framed photographs and a handful of children's toys scattered on the floor. The child let go of James's hand and walked slowly towards a small, makeshift shrine in the corner, kneeling down reverently. As she did, Richard felt a jolt of recognition. One of the toys, a small, faded wooden horse, looked hauntingly similar to one his own daughter, Emily, had once cherished. Could it be possible? Was this somehow connected to his past, to his own loss? He felt a strange, inexplicable connection forming a bridge across worlds he didn't understand. James then began to explain. The child, he said, was the granddaughter of someone who had been a friend of Richard's family long, long ago. A family with secrets buried so deep that only a few ever knew the truth. And now, fate, or something like it, had placed Richard in a position where he could no longer ignore it. Richard's mind was racing, trying to process the information. Why had no one ever told him about this child? How was she linked to his daughter? Why was James, the quiet cemetery janitor, protecting her? Before he could voice any of his frantic questions, James put a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder. You will understand soon, he said, his voice calm and reassuring. Everything will be revealed in time. But first, you must promise to trust. Trust, it was a currency Richard rarely dealt in. His entire life had been built on contracts, on negotiations, on control. But here, in this candlelit crypt, trust seemed to be the only way forward. He looked from James's earnest face to the child's hopeful one. As he gave a slow, hesitant nod, the child reached out and touched his hand. Her small fingers were surprisingly warm, and that simple touch seemed to radiate a warmth that made Richard's heart ache with a long-forgotten feeling. He realized, with a sudden, painful clarity, how empty his life had become, devoid of this kind of connection, this simple human bond. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the stone outside, but inside the crypt, the atmosphere felt charged, electric, as though a hidden force was preparing to show him a reality he had never been ready to face. Richard glanced at James again and whispered, I promise, but I need to know everything. The janitor only smiled faintly, a knowing, almost sad smile. All in time, Richard, all in time. The child then pointed a small finger towards a wooden box, partially hidden beneath a stack of old photographs and toys. Inside, she whispered. Inside lay a collection of letters, more photographs, and what appeared to be a leather-bound diary. Richard felt a strange thrill of anticipation, a surge of adrenaline. He knew, instinctively, that whatever was in that box would explain everything, or at least provide the first crucial clue to unraveling this whole impossible mystery. As he reached for it, James warned him, don't open it. Not yet. Richard looked up, frustrated. Why not? The right moment hasn't come, said the janitor, his tone leaving no room for argument. Your heart is not ready to face the full truth. Richard resisted the powerful urge to snatch the box and tear it open. His curiosity was a physical ache, almost unbearable, but he knew, deep down, that James was right. This story was unfolding piece by piece, layer by layer, and he had to be patient. Suddenly the child gasped, her eyes wide with alarm. Something is coming, she whispered, her voice trembling. They are coming. We must hide. Richard felt a sudden surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp. Who could possibly be coming to a cemetery in the middle of a storm? And why would they want to harm this child, or James? Without a word, they moved silently, deeper into the crypt, pressing themselves into the darkest corners. Shadows danced menacingly on the walls as the wind rattled the heavy stone entrance. A shiver ran down Richard's spine. It was used to danger, but it was the danger of boardrooms and hostile takeovers, of numbers on a screen. This was different. This was personal. This was real. Outside the crypt, faint footsteps echoed, splashing through the puddles. Someone was approaching, and the relentless rain did little to mask the sound. Richard held his breath, his heart pounding against his ribs. Everything was about to change. The child clung to him, her small body trembling. "Stay close, sir," she whispered, her breath warm against his neck. "Protect me." Richard nodded, a wave of fierce determination washing over him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with money or power. He realized this was more than just a mystery or a strange coincidence. It was a test of his courage, of his humanity, and perhaps, of his ability to finally face the ghosts of his own past. As the footsteps grew closer, a shadow fell across the entrance. Richard instinctively stepped forward, shielding the child with his own body. Beside him, James stood ready, his posture tense, prepared for a confrontation. And then, the first face appeared in the opening, illuminated for a fraction of a second by a distant flash of lightning. It was someone Richard never expected to see. Someone he knew all too well. His heart skipped a beat, then hammered in his chest. The moment had finally come. The secrets that had been buried for so long were about to be forced into the open, and nothing would ever be the same again. What happens next? Richard confronts the stranger at the crypt entrance, discovering shocking truths that will shake him to his very core. He'll be forced to make a choice that could change everything. The shadow at the entrance shifted, inching closer until the darkness gave way to a face. It was a man, older than Richard, with eyes that were sharp, piercing, and held a presence that didn't just command respect, it radiated menace. James took a slight step forward, a subtle movement, careful not to provoke. "This isn't just about you," he said, his words aimed at Richard, but seemingly for everyone. "It's about trust. It's about the choices you make and what you are willing to risk for the truth." A surge of anger, hot and sharp, mixed with a burning curiosity rose in Richard. Just then, the child whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the heavy silence. "Something is wrong. I feel it, something hidden. I'm scared." Richard looked down at her wide, searching eyes. He realized the fear wasn't just hers. It was in the air itself, a palpable thing, a scent of secrets long buried and starting to stir. The older man spoke again, his voice dropping slightly. "You will need to make a decision, Richard. You can walk away from this, right now. Forget you ever saw this place, this child, or you can step fully into this reality. But know this, the path you choose will define not only your life, but hers, and perhaps the future of everything connected to this family." A chill, cold and sharp, ran down Richard's spine. He'd never faced a choice like this before. Though she was gone, that lesson was etched into his soul. I have watched over her for years. I kept her hidden, protected. Richard took a deep breath, leaning down to whisper to the child, "Stay close to me, we'll face this together." The older man stepped away from the wall, revealing what had been hidden behind him, a dark, narrow passage, leading deeper into the crypt, deeper into the unknown. The truth was waiting in that darkness. Richard felt a potent mix of fear, anticipation, and a white-hot determination. He was stepping into uncharted territory, a place where secrets held the power of life and death, and where the true meaning of love, loss, and trust would be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The next chapter of his life was about to begin, and it started with a single step into that passage. Richard stepped cautiously into the hidden passage, his hand brushing against the damp, cold stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of earth and old secrets, and the sound of distant, dripping water echoed around him, a lonely metronome counting away the seconds in this forgotten place. James followed closely behind, the child clinging to Richard's side, her small hand a warm anchor in the chilling darkness. Every step they took was measured and silent, a procession into the unknown. As they moved deeper, Richard began to notice symbols carved into the walls. They were unfamiliar markings, ancient yet deliberate, each one seeming to tell a story, or perhaps, a warning. He could feel the immense weight of history pressing down on him, a tangible presence in the cramped corridor. It was as if the very stones were watching, judging. At the end of the passage, they arrived in a small, circular chamber, dimly lit by the flickering glow of a single, old-fashioned lantern. The walls were lined with rough-hewn shelves, laden with old books, leather-bound and fragile. Faded photographs and tarnished frames and strange antique artifacts that seemed to belong to another time filled the remaining space. It was a time capsule, a secret museum of a life he never knew existed. James motioned for Richard to come closer, his hand gesturing towards a framed photograph on one of the shelves. It was a picture of a young woman with a kind smile, holding a baby wrapped in a white blanket. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the image. The baby looked strikingly like the child he was now protecting. The same wide, intelligent eyes, the same curve of the cheek. The older man from before, the one who had led them to this secret place, stepped forward from the shadows. "Your curiosity is natural," he said, his voice a gentle rumble that seemed to fill the small room. "These are the remnants of a legacy, one kept secret for generations." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "The child you see," he continued, "is part of a family that has long been intertwined with yours. Those circumstances kept that connection hidden. Until now." Richard struggled to comprehend the revelation. His mind, usually so sharp and decisive, raced through 1,000 possibilities, none of which made any sense. The child, Emily's cousin, or even her niece. How could that be possible? Why had no one, not his parents, not his grandparents, ever told him about this hidden branch of their family? It felt like the foundation of his life. Everything he thought he knew was suddenly built on sand. James, sensing his turmoil, opened one of the ancient books on a small wooden table. Inside, nestled between the brittle pages, were letters written in elegant, looping script. The ink faded but still legible. They were written decades ago, yet as Richard began to read, each word seemed to breathe life into the past. revealing promises made under moonlight, devastating betrayals kept in the dark, and silent sacrifices that had been quietly endured for the sake of family. The more Richard read, the more he understood the staggering complexity of what he had stumbled into. This wasn't just a simple family secret. It was a saga of love, loss, and profound duty. The child, who had been watching him with an unnerving stillness, leaned closer, her small finger pointing to the pages. Her eyes were wide, not with confusion, but with a startling recognition. It was as if she understood the story on some deep, instinctive level, a connection that went far beyond words or explanations. The older man continued his quiet narration. These documents hold not just history, but responsibility. A responsibility that has now, through a chain of events you are only beginning to understand, been passed to you. Your choices from this moment forward will affect this child, this family, and the future of everything that has been safeguarded in this room for decades. Richard felt the weight of that responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. It was a different kind of weight than he was used to. He had always thought of himself as a man of action, a decision-maker in boardrooms and business deals, but this was deeply personal, impossibly dangerous, and tied to emotions he couldn't simply quantify or ignore. He turned to James, his voice tense, almost a whisper. "How am I supposed to handle all of this? I don't even know where to begin." James offered a faint, reassuring smile. "The first step is to understand the full story," he said. "That is why you were brought here. To witness, to learn, and to prepare. To prepare for the decisions that will define not just your life, but hers as well." Richard looked at the child, and in her eyes, he saw a mixture of hope and fear that mirrored his own. But beneath it all, he saw trust. She trusted him, completely and without question. And that trust fueled a determination within him he hadn't felt in years. He realized that protecting her meant more than just keeping her physically safe. It meant embracing this impossible legacy, embracing this crushing responsibility, and facing the painful truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The older man then guided them to a small wooden chest tucked away in the darkest corner of the chamber. With a quiet click, he opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay more letters, more photographs, and a single sealed envelope addressed to his daughter, Emily. Richard's hands trembled as he reached out and held the envelope. The paper was old, the wax seal unbroken. Could this be a message meant for him to find? Or was it the final piece of the puzzle he had been desperately searching for? The anticipation was a physical ache in his chest. James placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "The time will come for you to open it," he said softly. "But for now, you must absorb what is here. Let the history guide your decisions. Let the past illuminate the path ahead." As Richard returned to the photographs scattered on the shelves, he began to study them with new eyes. He started to recognize faces he had only seen in fleeting childhood memories or old, forgotten family albums. A great-aunt who had supposedly moved away. A cousin who was said to have died young. Connections began to form. Secrets started to reveal themselves, and he finally understood. The child was not just an innocent bystander caught in this story. She was a key figure, the living heart of this legacy, and her future depended entirely on his actions. As if hearing his thoughts, the child spoke softly, her voice clear in the still air. "Sir," she said, looking up at the photograph of the young woman with the baby. "She's my grandmother, isn't she?" Richard looked down at her small, serious face and nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, the word feeling both momentous and inadequate. "I believe she is, and now, it's our responsibility to make sure her legacy continues." The older man added a final, somber note. "Every choice matters. Every decision carries weight. And be warned, there are those who will try to influence you. Those who do not understand the importance of protecting what has been hidden for so long." A surge of pure, unyielding determination coursed through Richard. Protecting this child, safeguarding these secrets, and confronting his own past were challenges he could no longer avoid. As the lantern flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls, they seemed to form the faces of those from the past, watching him, waiting. Richard understood that this moment was a pivot point in his life, and that the journey ahead would test his courage, his wisdom, and the very depths of human connection. Richard hunched over the wooden chest, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. He meticulously studied the photographs and letters, trying to piece together a puzzle that spanned generations. Each faded image, each elegant loop of cursive, drew him deeper into a hidden legacy he never knew existed. The more he learned, the more he realized the staggering complexity of it all. It wasn't just about money or property. It was a tapestry of secrets, promises, and burdens. The child, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, pressed closer to him. The figure remained shrouded, its features obscured, but its intent was crystal clear. They were here to take control, to seize the secrets that had been buried for decades. Finding a strength he didn't know he possessed, Richard stepped forward from behind James, his voice steady and firm, ringing with newfound authority. "You will not take her," he declared. "This child belongs to no one but those who protect her." The intruder let out a soft, chilling laugh, a sound that seemed to crawl under Richard's skin and make his blood run cold. "You are too late," the voice hissed from the shadows. "The secrets are tempting, powerful, and those who control them gain more than you can possibly imagine." James moved closer to Richard, his presence a reassuring weight. "You must trust your instincts," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Keep her safe, and follow my lead." Richard gave a firm nod. In that single, decisive moment, he understood. There was no more time for hesitation, for doubt. Every second they delayed could cost the child her safety. This intruder was skilled, patient, and undeniably dangerous. But Richard felt a new kind of courage surging through him, a resolve he hadn't felt in years. A small voice whispered from behind him. "Sir," the child said, her voice trembling slightly, "don't let them get me. I trust you." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. The weight of that trust, of that responsibility, pressed down on him, but it also gave him a startling clarity. He had faced countless challenges in the world of business, high stakes, negotiations, and corporate battles. But this was different. This was life and death. This was personal. A moment of tense stillness, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back, melting away into the shadows and disappearing. Testing your resolve and your ability to protect the legacy. Richard managed a faint, reassuring smile. He knelt down to her level. "We will be okay, and I promise, I will not let anyone harm you." but would also completely redefine his understanding of family, loyalty, and his own identity. After the intruder vanished, the chamber fell silent. Only the faint, rhythmic sound of dripping water echoed off the stone walls. Richard felt his heartbeat slowly steady, but the knot of tension in his stomach didn't disappear. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was only the beginning. James moved with a swift, practiced urgency, gathering the most important letters and photographs from the old wooden chest. His eyes kept darting back to the passage, as if expecting another intrusion at any moment. The child, small and quiet, stayed close to Richard, her small hand gripping his coat. Her trust in him seemed to grow stronger with every passing second, a weight and a comfort all at once. "We can't stay here long," James said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "Too many eyes are watching. The moment they realize you are involved, everything changes." Richard nodded, his mind already shifting from the initial shock into a state of cold, calculated strategy. Years of running companies, of navigating corporate espionage and boardroom battles, had taught him how to stay calm under immense pressure. He never imagined those skills would matter more than they did right now. In a damp, hidden chamber, protecting a child from an unseen enemy, they moved through a narrow, concealed exit, leaving the chamber behind. The path twisted through claustrophobic stone corridors, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. Finally, they emerged behind the old cemetery, near an abandoned maintenance building that slumped against the tree line. The rain was still falling, a steady drizzle that cloaked them in darkness and offered a fragile sense of cover. Inside the building, James bolted the door and turned to face Richard, his expression grim. "There is something you must know before we go any further," he said, his voice low and serious. "The threat, it isn't coming from strangers, it's coming from within your own circle." Richard felt his stomach tighten, a cold dread creeping up his spine. "What do you mean?" James took a deep, steadying breath. "Some members of your extended family and a few former business partners. They know fragments of the legacy. They've been searching for years, quietly, patiently. And now, they know you're close to the truth." Richard's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Betrayal was a familiar sting in his world, a currency traded as often as stocks. But this cut deeper. This was family. This was personal. The older man stepped forward, his eyes filled with a weary understanding. "You trusted them once, Richard, and they used that trust to bury the past, to keep things hidden for their own gain. They believed the child is the final key to gaining control over what was hidden." The child looked up at them, her eyes wide with confusion. Control of what? Richard knelt in front of her, his voice softening. "Control of power, money, and influence," he explained gently. "But none of that matters to us. What matters is keeping you safe." She nodded slowly, though a flicker of fear still danced in her eyes. "I just want to live a normal life," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the sound of the rain against the roof. Her simple words struck Richard harder than any threat, than any revelation of betrayal. In that instant, he realized what he was truly fighting for. It wasn't about some forgotten wealth or a dusty legacy. It was about her chance at a peaceful future, a life untouched by all of this. James's voice cut through his thoughts. "There are allies too, people who stayed silent out of fear, but they're ready to help now. They've been waiting for someone strong enough to protect the child, and brave enough to face the truth." Richard stood, a new resolve hardening his features. He felt taller, stronger. "Then, we find them," he declared, his voice firm, "and we end this." They left the derelict building, moving carefully through the sleeping city. They drove through empty, rain-slicked streets, toward a safe house on the outskirts of town. The child fell asleep in the back seat, one of the old photographs clutched tightly in her hand. Richard watched her in the rearview mirror, his heart heavy with the weight of his promise, yet resolute in his purpose. At the safe house, a sterile, anonymous apartment, James revealed more names. Each one sent a fresh shock through Richard. Some were people he had trusted for decades. People who had smiled across his dinner table, sharing wine and laughter while hiding devastating secrets. The depth of the deception was staggering. That night, sleep was impossible for Richard. He sat by the window, watching the rain trace paths down the glass, his mind a whirlwind of faces and memories. He thought about Emily, about the life he had lost, and about the young life that had now been placed in his care. He finally understood. The legacy wasn't about money or power. It was about protection, sacrifice, and the silent, difficult choices that truly define who a person is. As the first hints of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Richard made a decision. He would expose every betrayal, he would secure the child's future, and he would dismantle the entire network that threatened her, no matter what it cost him personally. This was no longer a mystery to be solved. This was a mission, and he was just getting started. In the next chapter, Richard confronts the betrayal head-on, exposing shocking truths about those closest to him and making a dangerous move that puts everything on the line. Morning light crept slowly through the windows of the safe house, but for Richard, there was no dawn. He hadn't slept a wink. His mind was a chaotic cinema, replaying every name James had mentioned. every face that had once smiled at him while hiding the ugliest truths. Betrayal wasn't a stranger in his world, not by a long shot. But this felt different. It was personal, a cruel, calculated wound. The child woke up quietly, her little footsteps barely making a sound as she came to sit beside him. She looked so small in the dim early light, so fragile, and yet she had a strength that most adults would never know. "Are they coming for us today?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through Richard's spiraling thoughts. He met her gaze, his own eyes heavy with the weight of the night. He couldn't lie to her. Not now, not ever. "Honestly, yes," he admitted, his voice rough, "but they will not take you. I promise you that." Just then, James entered the room, his presence urgent but his expression unnervingly calm. "They've made their move," he said, the words hanging in the air. He was too calm, Richard thought, for words that carried such immense weight. "One of your closest associates has requested an emergency meeting," James continued, his eyes fixed on Richard. "They think you're still in the dark. They believe you don't know the truth." A flicker of something, an opportunity, sparked in the gloom. "And that," James concluded, "gives us the advantage." Richard let out a slow, deliberate breath. The exhaustion, the anger, the fear, it all coalesced into a single point of resolve. "Then we meet them," he declared. The decision was made. There was no turning back now. The meeting was set for one of Richard's private office buildings. It was a place he had designed himself, a fortress of glass and steel built for power plays and control. But today, standing outside, it felt different. It felt like a battlefield, one where the only weapons were words, secrets, and raw courage. He arrived alone, on purpose. The message had to be crystal clear. This was his fight, his decision, his responsibility. Inside the conference room, 3 figures were already seated. 2 business partners he'd built empires with, and 1 family member. Someone who had shared holidays, laughter, and a lifetime of memories with him. Seeing their familiar faces, faces he'd trusted, twisted his stomach into a painful knot. "You look tired, Richard," one of them said, the casualness of the remark like a slap in the face. Richard didn't bother to sit down. He remained standing, a solitary figure against the city skyline. "I know about the child," he said, his voice cutting through the pretense like a razor. "I know about the legacy. And I know about all the lies." A heavy silence descended upon the room. It was absolute, suffocating. The easy smiles on their faces vanished, replaced by masks of disbelief and then dawning fury. The truth had finally landed. "You were never meant to find out," one of the partners finally replied, his voice cold and sharp. "That power, it was supposed to stay buried." Richard took a step closer to the long, polished table that separated them. "Power means nothing if it destroys innocent lives," he shot back, his own voice rising. "You endangered a child." The family member, the one whose betrayal cut the deepest, stood up abruptly. "We protected our interests. The child was a risk." Those words. Something inside Richard just snapped. "A child is not a risk," he roared, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "She is a life." Suddenly, the floodgates opened. Voices rose, accusations flew across the table like poison darts. Years, decades, of deception and manipulation spilled out into the open. It became terrifyingly clear they had never planned to stop. They only ever planned to win, no matter the cost, no matter who they had to crush along the way. Richard leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his eyes boring into theirs. "This ends now," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low tone. "You walk away from this, from her, from everything, or it all comes out." They laughed, a cold, arrogant sound that grated on his last nerve. "You really think anyone will believe you? A lone man against us?" Richard didn't even flinch. He simply pressed a button on his phone, which was already resting on the table. And then, the room was filled with voices. Their voices, recordings of confessions, hushed conversations about their plans. Everything James and his network of allies had painstakingly gathered. The color drained from their faces, the arrogance replaced with pure, unadulterated panic. "You underestimate how far I'm willing to go," Richard said quietly, the words landing with the finality of a death sentence. That meeting marked the end of their silent control, the shattering of their corrupt empire. But Richard knew, as he walked out of that building and back into the uncertain sunlight, that it also marked the beginning of a new, more open kind of danger. They wouldn't just surrender. Back at the safe house, his fears were confirmed. James met him at the door, his expression grim. "They're desperate now, Richard, and you know what desperate people do. Desperate people make dangerous, unpredictable moves." The war wasn't over. It had just entered its most volatile phase. That night, as he was tucking the child into bed, she looked up at him with those impossibly old eyes. "Are they bad people?" she asked. Richard paused, thinking carefully about how to answer. "How do you explain such darkness to someone so young?" "Some people," he said finally, stroking her hair, "they forget what really matters in life, and it's our job to remind them." In that moment, he realized just how much this journey had changed him. The man who once measured his life in profits and acquisitions now measured it in protection and truth. He felt a sense of purpose he'd never known before. But as he looked at the sleeping child, a knot of dread tightened in his chest. The storm wasn't over. It was just gathering strength, preparing to unleash its full fury. And he was right to be afraid, because coming next, a sudden, shocking betrayal will put the child in immediate, mortal danger, forcing Richard to make the most difficult and heartbreaking decision of his entire life. The night felt unnaturally quiet. I sensed it even before James spoke. Something was wrong. The kind of wrong that creeps in when the danger is already at your door. James burst into the room, his movements fast and tense. "They found us," he said. There was no panic in his voice, only cold, hard certainty. Before I could even begin to process his words, the lights cut out. Darkness swallowed the safe house in an instant. A small gasp came from beside me, and I felt a tiny hand grab my arm. "Stay with me," I whispered, pulling the child close. The first footsteps echoed outside. Then, a splintering crash as a door was forced open somewhere in the house. The tinkling sound of shattering glass followed. James moved with a speed that defied the darkness, guiding us toward a hidden exit I knew was built beneath the house. The older man, our mentor and guardian, stayed behind. He turned to block the corridor, a silent sentinel against the coming storm. For a fleeting second, our eyes met, and for the first time, I saw fear in them. "Go," he said, his voice a low command. "Protect her, no matter what." I hesitated for only a moment, the weight of his words settling on my shoulders. Then, I obeyed. I led the child down the narrow, rickety stairs, descending into the underground passage. The air down here was cold and heavy with the scent of damp earth. Above us, the muffled sounds of shouting and struggle echoed, a chaotic symphony of violence. We finally reached the reinforced door James had shown me during our initial briefing. I put my shoulder into it, pushing it open, and quickly ushered the child through. As I turned to slam it shut behind us, a hand shot out of the darkness and grabbed my shoulder. It was one of them, one of the traitors from our own ranks. His face was bloodied, his eyes wide with a furious, desperate light. "You cannot take her," he snarled, his breath hot and ragged. "She belongs to the legacy." I shoved him back with all my strength. The child screamed, a piercing sound that cut through the chaos. "This is where it ends," I said, my voice low and steady as I stepped between them, shielding her with my own body. He lunged, a wild animal driven by fanaticism, but I stood my ground. This wasn't about power or politics anymore. All the years of guilt, the pain, the loss, it all fueled me in that moment. I wasn't fighting for some abstract ideal. I was fighting for her future. The struggle was brief, brutal, and decisive. He fell back, defeated, his desperate lunge ending in failure. I slammed the heavy door shut, the bolt sliding home with a final, deafening thud. The immediate threat was gone. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to my knees, my heart pounding against my ribs like a war drum. Tiny arms wrapped around my neck, and I felt her small body pressed against mine, shaking with sobs. "I thought I lost you," she whispered into my shoulder. I held her tight, my own body trembling from the adrenaline and the fear. "I'm here," I managed to say, my voice thick with emotion. "I will always be here." We made our way through the rest of the tunnel, emerging into the cool, dark air of the forest. And there, waiting for us, were James and the older man. They were alive, but wounded, their faces etched with the strain of the fight. "We lost the house," James said, stating the obvious, but not the mission. The child looked up at the older man, her voice small but clear. "Sir," she asked, "are we safe now?" I looked from her innocent face up to the vast, star-dusted night sky, and then back down at her. "Not yet," I answered softly, "but soon." In that moment, a new, chilling realization washed over me. The final step remained. To truly end this, to secure her future once and for all, one last sacrifice still had to be made. And what happens next is the part of the story you won't see coming. I'm about to make a life-changing sacrifice, a choice that will guarantee her safety, but it will cost me everything I once was, and everything I ever valued. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound piercing the quiet being the distant, mournful wail of sirens. Richard knew instantly they weren't for him, not in the way he'd once feared. They were the sound of a world waking up, the sound of truth finally clawing its way into the light. His heart hammered against his ribs. James had made the calls. Their allies were on the move, but a chilling thought followed. So were their enemies. The race was on. They found the shelter James had prepared, a small forgotten cabin tucked deep within the ancient woods. It was nothing more than a few rough-hewn walls and a roof, cold and damp, but it was a fortress of anonymity. For now, it was safe. Inside, the child sat on a small cot, her small figure looking even smaller in the dim light. She was clutching the photograph she'd taken from the cemetery, the one of her parents. Her eyes, usually so bright, were heavy with exhaustion, yet when she looked at him, they held an unwavering trust that both warmed and terrified him. The silence in the cabin was thick, heavy with unspoken fears. James, ever the pragmatist, was the one to break it. His voice was low, a gravelly whisper that seemed to be absorbed by the wooden walls. "They will not stop," he said, his gaze fixed on Richard, "not even after tonight." The only way to truly end this, to cut the head off the snake, is to remove the prize. Richard didn't need him to elaborate. The words hung in the air, each one a lead weight. The prize, the legacy, the immense wealth, the labyrinth of influence, the power that stretched across continents. Everything he had built. Everything that had turned this innocent child into a target. He understood immediately. The older man, James, saw the understanding dawn on Richard's face and nodded slowly. You have to make it disappear. Or give it away. Every last bit, completely scorched the earth, so there's nothing left for them to fight over. The weight of that decision felt physical. Like the roof of the cabin was slowly lowering, threatening to crush him. His empire. It wasn't just money. It was a lifetime of battles, of sacrifices, of sleepless nights. It was his identity, the armor he had forged in the fires of his own painful past. It was his proof to the world, and to himself, that he could not be broken. But looking at the small child on the cot, he saw with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that none of it mattered. Not anymore. If I do this, Richard began, the words catching in his throat, tasting like ash. I lose everything. James's reply was instant, cutting through his despair. You gain something far greater. Peace for her. At the sound of their serious tones, the child looked up, her brow furrowed in confusion. Her small voice was a melody in the grim silence. Sir, what are you talking about? Richard's resolve solidified. He moved across the small room and knelt in front of her, the rough floorboards pressing into his knees. He took her small, cold hands into his own. I have something, he said, his voice gentle, trying to keep the tremor out of it. Something that very bad people want. If I let it go, if I give it away, they'll stop chasing us. They'll leave you alone. Her little frown deepened. Her logic was simple, pure, but then you'll be sad. A sad, soft smile touched Richard's lips. It was the most honest expression he'd worn in years. Maybe for a little while, he admitted, but I would much rather be sad than ever see you get hurt. That was all it took. Her lower lip trembled, and tears welled in her big, trusting eyes. In a single motion, she launched herself forward, wrapping her arms around his neck in a fierce, tight hug. Her voice was muffled against his shoulder, but her words were clear. Do it, then. I want to be safe. That single moment shattered him and rebuilt him all at once. The last of his armor fell away, not with a clang, but with a quiet release. He held her tightly, breathing in the scent of pine and innocence, and he knew what he had to do. He had found his purpose, and it wasn't in a boardroom. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and pink, Richard began to dismantle his life. The calls were made, one after another, a cascade of destruction and creation. He transferred ownership of corporations to charitable foundations. He dissolved labyrinthian trusts that had hidden fortunes for generations. He exposed secrets, his own and those of his enemies, feeding a torrent of evidence to stunned authorities and ravenous journalists. The empire, a structure that had seemed eternal and invincible, collapsed in a matter of hours. The world reeled. Headlines exploded across news sites, screaming of the biggest corporate implosion in history. Markets shook, fortunes were wiped out, and his enemies, suddenly exposed and powerless, scattered like rats from a sinking ship. By sunset, it was over. The threat was gone, neutralized completely. Richard sat in the quiet of the cabin, watching the news on a small, battery-powered tablet. His face, once plastered on every financial magazine, was now the center of a global scandal, a cautionary tale. But he felt no regret. Beside him, curled up under a worn blanket, the child slept peacefully, her breathing deep and even. The world no longer knew him as a billionaire, a titan of industry. He was just a man in a cabin in the woods. And for the first time in decades, Richard felt completely, utterly free. And so, their journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. In the next part of our story, we'll see how Richard and the child start a new life from the ashes of the old, discovering that the greatest wealth he ever possessed wasn't the money he gave away, but the love and redemption he found. Weeks passed quietly after the world stopped talking about Richard Hayes. The news cycle, with its insatiable appetite for the next big story, moved on, as it always did. But for Richard, life had changed forever. The relentless glare of the media, the endless speculation, the weight of a life lived under a microscope, all of it had faded into a distant memory. Like a bad dream you can barely recall upon waking. They now lived in a small, quiet town, nestled far from the concrete jungles of the city, far from the pressure of boardrooms and the fleeting fame of headlines. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the rising sun and the changing seasons, not by stock market tickers and quarterly reports. Their house was simple, modest, and filled with a warmth Richard had never known. It was the kind of place he once would have driven past without a second glance, dismissing it as unremarkable, insignificant. In his old life, he was surrounded by opulence, by cavernous rooms designed to impress rather than comfort, by cold marble and glass that reflected a man he no longer recognized. But this little house, with its creaky floorboards and sun-drenched kitchen, felt different. It felt real. It felt like home. The child, the center of his new universe, started school under a new name, a fresh identity scrubbed clean of the past. It was amazing to watch the transformation. She laughed more freely now, a sound that filled the small house with a joy Richard hadn't realized was missing from his life. She ran through the fields behind their home without constantly looking over her shoulder, her small legs carrying her towards a future unburdened by fear. At night, she slept soundly, peacefully, no longer haunted by the shadows that had once tormented her. Richard would often watch her from a distance, a quiet observer amazed at how quickly peace could take root and grow when the poison of danger was finally removed. It was like watching a wilted flower slowly turn its face back towards the sun, finding the strength to bloom again. James, their stoic guardian, visited often. His arrivals were always unannounced, his presence a silent reassurance. He'd check in, share a quiet cup of coffee, and then be on his way, refusing to stay for too long. "My role in this is finished," he would say, his voice gruff but his eyes holding a softer light. But Richard knew better. James wasn't just a former associate or a hired protector, he was something more. He was a guardian, a sentinel. Richard understood that some people were destined to be guardians, not residents. They were the ones who stood watch on the walls, ensuring the safety of those inside, never seeking comfort or a permanent place for themselves. Their purpose was in the protection, not the participation, and for that, Richard was eternally grateful. One crisp afternoon, when the autumn leaves were painted in shades of gold and crimson, Richard took the child back to the cemetery. It wasn't the same day, not the same raw, gut-wrenching pain that had brought him there before. The sharp edges of grief had been softened by time and purpose. A different feeling settled over him this time, one not of loss, but of profound gratitude. They stood at Emily's grave in silence, the only sound, the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Richard finally broke the silence, his voice soft, barely more than a whisper carried on the breeze. "I wish you could see this," he said, looking at the name etched into the stone. A faint sad smile touched his lips. "You would have loved her." The child stepped forward and carefully placed a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked by the headstone. Her voice was just as quiet, a pure and innocent whisper. "Thank you for bringing us together." Richard felt the familiar sting of tears welling in his eyes, but this time, he didn't hide them. He didn't turn away or clench his jaw. He had learned one of life's most important lessons. Strength was not found in silence or stoicism. It was found in honesty, in the courage to feel everything without shame. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink, they sat together on the front porch. The world was quiet, peaceful. The child, feeling safe and content, leaned against him, her small frame a comforting weight. "Sir," she asked, her voice sleepy, "are you happy now?" The question hung in the air, simple yet profound. Richard thought about his old life, the high-stakes deals, the immense power, the crushing, isolating loneliness that had been his constant companion. He thought of the empty mansions and the superficial relationships, a life rich in possessions but bankrupt in spirit. Then, he looked down at the little girl, resting her head on his shoulder, the embodiment of everything he now held dear. "I am richer now," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "than I ever was." She smiled, a sweet, trusting smile that reached her eyes, and snuggled closer, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon. In that perfect, tranquil moment, Richard Hayes understood the truth at last. True wealth wasn't about money or control. It wasn't about stock portfolios or corporate takeovers. It was the courage to protect the innocent, the humility to let go of a life that was destroying you, and the boundless love that grows in the space where fear used to live. His story didn't end with a dramatic victory or public vindication. There were no victory parades or triumphant headlines. It ended with peace, quiet, unassuming, profound peace. And that, he realized, was everything.